I have spent most of my life walking into places other people spend their entire lives avoiding: abandoned streets, houses holding their breath, rooms where the silence is too heavy for the living. And yet, nothing prepared me for Imperial Avenue in Cleveland, not because it was loud or violent or filled with the kind of danger that announces itself. No, Imperial Avenue was quiet, too quiet, a quiet that rotted from the inside out. This is Miller Files, and this is the beginning of one of the darkest investigations I have ever walked into. The Anthony Sowell case. 11 women who vanished in plain sight. A neighborhood that learned to ignore the smell of death. And a killer who hid in a house surrounded by people who believed that horrors only lived far away from them. My first steps on Imperial Avenue came long after the last screams had faded, long after the house on the corner had been sealed with yellow tape and the forensic teams had gone home to scrub their boots. But even then, even months later, the air still felt bruised, heavy, like something had pressed down on this street and refused to lift its weight. People who lived there didn't talk openly. They spoke the way people do when memories hurt. Short answers, eyes looking past you, shoulders tense. The kind of body language you see when individuals still fear the thing is not entirely gone. Trauma doesn't disappear at the same pace as police sirens. Imperial Avenue was proof of that. But before the world knew the name Anthony Sowell, the street knew the smell. That's where this story truly begins. Not with missing persons reports, not with forensic teams, not even with the first victim. It begins with a smell rising from a house no one wanted to question. A resident once told me he thought the odor came from a dead animal. Another believed it was coming from the nearby sausage factory. Someone else assumed it was garbage left out too long in the heat. Everyone had explanations. Everyone had excuses. That is how a neighborhood learns to coexist with horror, by rationalizing it until the truth dissolves into something easier to swallow. When I interviewed the first few neighbors, they all said the same thing. They smelled it for months, but no one expected what it really was. And that is perhaps the greatest tragedy of the victims on Imperial Avenue. They were invisible long before their deaths. Forgotten women from forgotten lives. Individuals struggling with poverty or addiction or homelessness, people society turns away from because seeing their suffering hurts more than pretending they don't exist. I remember standing across from Sowell's house for the first time. If I hadn't known what happened there, I might have walked right past it. A 2-story home with peeling paint, a sagging porch, and windows that looked like they had given up years before the truth came out. There was nothing extraordinary about it, nothing that screamed danger. Serial killers don't live in haunted mansions or neon-lit lairs. They live in houses like this. Ordinary on the outside, catastrophic on the inside. Inside that house, 11 women spent their final minutes begging for a chance to breathe, but I didn't know their full stories yet. I only knew the outlines, the gaps, the nameless silhouettes. The city had names, but names aren't stories, and stories aren't justice. To understand how a man like Sowell managed to kill for years undetected, I had to understand the neighborhood he hid within. Imperial Avenue was a place where trust had died long before the first victim did. People stayed inside at night. They shut their blinds early. They minded their own business because minding your business is how you survive in places where hope doesn't visit often. Homes were old, streets cracked, opportunities rare, and in that atmosphere, predators flourish. They blend in. They learn the rhythm of the street and mimic it until no one considers them a threat. There was something else about this street that struck me. The silence had layers. It wasn't just the stillness of an ordinary day. It was the silence of people carrying unspoken guilt. Every person I talked to wondered whether they should have known sooner, whether they should have looked deeper, whether they should have called for help one more time. Guilt is heavy, and this neighborhood carried it like a second skin. One neighbor recalled waking up one night, hearing a scream, but brushed it off because screaming wasn't unusual. Noise was part of the ecosystem. Trouble was background music. When suffering becomes normal, it becomes easier to ignore. That truth haunts me. When I visited the back lot behind the house, the earth still felt unsettled. Soil remembers. Even when authorities remove every visible trace, the ground holds a memory of the weight it once carried. That lot had carried too much. It had held secrets the world refused to listen to. This wasn't just an investigation about a killer. It was an investigation about how an entire system failed. Failed the women who vanished, failed their families, failed itself. And to understand the failure, I needed to understand how everything started, how a house known for violence decades earlier eventually became the epicenter of one of the worst serial murder cases in modern American history. The house wasn't always Sowell's. It belonged to his stepmother. Long before the murders, he lived there as a teenager. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a breeding ground for trauma. His childhood was filled with abuse. Violence was normal. Pain was routine. No one becomes a serial killer overnight. Some roads to darkness are paved early, and Sowell's path was built brick by brick. But a tragic childhood doesn't justify what he became. It only explains the cracks in the foundation. As I walked through the street, I remembered stories from survivors. Women who escaped him. Women whose voices were dismissed because no one wanted to believe the words of the invisible. They tried to warn people. They tried to speak. But they were pushed aside. Their truth wiped away by prejudice. People hear selectively. They believe what suits them. They ignore what burdens them. There was one survivor who told police she had been strangled inside that house. The officers didn't press the case. They believed Sowell's version of events over hers. This single decision may have cost lives. A killer thrives when disbelief protects him, and for years, disbelief wrapped Anthony Sowell like armor. The more I learned about the victims' lives, the more painful the landscape of Imperial Avenue became. These weren't nameless women. They were mothers, daughters, friends. Some struggled with addiction. Others were down on their luck. But they were human beings whose lives should have mattered. Instead, they slipped through the cracks. And the crack was wide enough to swallow 11 lives. One detail stuck with me. Some women were reported missing, but officers assumed they had simply left the area. That missing persons reports were optional for people living unstable lives, that they were too difficult to track, too transient, too forgotten. As a detective, I have learned the hard way, the moment you categorize someone as less important, you open the door to monsters. Standing in front of Saul's house, I tried to imagine the nights when victims walked toward their final destination. What were they thinking? Did they believe they were safe? Did they believe this man was offering kindness? Or did they sense danger but follow anyway? Because desperation makes people trust the wrong hands. A killer like Sowell doesn't just kill with violence. He kills by offering something first: a drink, a meal, a safe place to rest. For people who have nowhere to go, that offer can feel like a lifeline. But lifelines can be traps. When the case finally broke open, people were shocked, outraged, confused. But shock is a luxury. Shock means you were distant enough to believe such horrors could never exist in your world. The people on Imperial Avenue didn't feel shock. They felt confirmation. They had lived alongside fear for so long that the truth was less of a revelation and more of a grim understanding of what they had tried to ignore. What stood out most from these early days of the investigation was how normal everything looked from the outside. The most horrific cases are always wrapped in ordinary packaging. That's why killers survive for so long. They hide in the shadow of normality. Every step I took down that street reminded me of the victims. Women who fought to survive in a world that refused to look at them. Women who deserved more than silence, more than neglect, more than blame. Women whose lives will never be fully known because the man who ended them never cared to remember their stories. This first part of the investigation isn't about the killer's methods or his psychology. It's about the environment that allowed him to exist. A street full of poverty, a system full of failures, a city full of blind spots, and within that space, a killer thrived. As the sun began to set over Cleveland, casting long shadows across Imperial Avenue, I felt the weight of the street settle on my shoulders. This wasn't the kind of case that ends neatly. This wasn't the kind of story that gives you heroic closure. This was the type of investigation that forces you to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters don't come from myths. They come from neighborhoods just like this. This is where the story begins, with a smell ignored, with women forgotten, with a house hiding a darkness the city refused to confront, and with me, Miller Files, walking straight into the shadows to uncover the truth buried beneath Imperial Avenue. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, I would follow the trails of the missing women. Tomorrow, I would step deeper into the life of Anthony Sowell, a man who learned how to kill in silence. But tonight, standing on that quiet street, I realized the most chilling part of the story wasn't what had happened inside the house. It was how long the world allowed it to happen. This is only the beginning. The first time you work a case where people vanish without a trace, you tell yourself you'll find a thread. That every disappearance leaves a mark. That someone always saw something, heard something, noticed something. But Imperial Avenue didn't give threads, it gave silence. And the silence grew louder with every woman who didn't come home. I began this part of the investigation with a wall covered in photographs. 11 women, 11 faces frozen in time, some smiling, some staring into the camera with eyes that carried exhaustion, some looking away as if caught between hope and surrender. When you stare at faces long enough, you start to feel responsible for their stories. Even the stories you don't yet know. The first reports of missing women came years before anyone said the name Anthony Sowell out loud. These were not the type of reports that triggered manhunts or citywide alerts. They were the kind of reports that gathered dust on desks, filed under the unspoken belief that these women lived unstable lives. Some battled addiction. Some moved between abandoned houses and friends' couches. Some had no fixed address at all. And society has a cruel habit of assuming that unstable lives can vanish without consequence. But people don't disappear because they're imperfect. They disappear because someone made them disappear. That is a truth investigators sometimes forget. I refused to. When I spoke to the families of the missing women, the pain was raw. Not sharp like fresh wounds, but deep like old bruises that never healed. Many of them had gone to the police more than once. They told officers their daughters, mothers, or sisters would never simply leave without a word. Some officers listened politely, but listening is not the same as believing. Believing is action. Believing is searching. Believing is refusing to let a missing person become a footnote. One woman told me she had gone to the station 3 times, insisting her sister was not the type to disappear. She said she felt like she was screaming into a void. The more she begged for help, the more she felt brushed aside. That's the thing about institutional neglect. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It suggests. It nudges. It tells you through the smallest behaviors that some lives matter less. In the early years, no one connected the disappearances. They happened one by one, scattered across time, scattered across neighborhoods, scattered across lives no one was documenting closely. Some families searched alone, some searched with neighbors, some waited at their windows each night, hoping to see a familiar silhouette walking home. As I dug deeper into the lives of these women, a pattern emerged. Not a clear, bold pattern, but a faint one, like footprints partially erased by rain. Many of them lived close to Imperial Avenue. Many frequented the same corner stores, shelters, and bus stops. Many walked the same routes at night, and many had crossed paths with a man people in the neighborhood knew but did not fear. A man who offered drinks, drugs, a place to sleep. A man no one suspected, because true danger rarely presents itself with a growl. Sometimes it offers you a chair at the table. One of the earliest cases that stood out was a woman named Crystal. Her family said she loved music and had a laugh that filled rooms. When she vanished, they searched the neighborhood for weeks. They posted flyers on telephone poles, knocked on doors, stood outside shelters with photographs. There was always someone who claimed to have seen her. People often confuse hope with memory. Then there was Tonya. She was quiet, but not fragile. Her sister said she trusted too easily. The last people to see her alive said she was walking toward Imperial Avenue around dusk, wearing a jacket too thin for the weather. I kept imagining that jacket, thin fabric between her and the cold. Thin fabric between her and a man who had already begun building his kingdom of silence. Another woman, Michelle, had reported being attacked by a man who lived on Imperial Avenue. She escaped. She told police. She begged them to arrest him. That single report could have stopped everything that happened afterward, could have saved women who were still alive at the time. But her warning dissolved into paperwork. The system looked at her life, judged it messy, and decided her truth was optional. I remember sitting in my car after interviewing her. The weight of her story pressed on me like a hand around the back of my neck. She had survived a nightmare, crawled out of it, and shouted her warning. But the world didn't turn its head. And when the world refuses to look, predators walk freely. The deeper I went into the missing persons cases, the more I realized how much effort it took to be unheard, how many voices had to be ignored, how many alarms had to be silenced, how many red flags had to be folded away. One family told me their daughter had gone missing for a week before anyone at the police department even opened the file. Another woman's case was marked as low priority because she had a history of drug use. When a system decides someone is unreliable, it also decides they are unworthy of rescue. I have seen this too many times. But something else haunted me. Some of these women were known to each other. They shared cigarettes, shared stories, shared long nights wandering the same streets. They warned each other about dangerous corners, aggressive men, and police sweeps. But they didn't warn each other about Soul. They didn't because they didn't know, because he wasn't a threat until he closed the door, because the beginning of their disappearances looked nothing like danger. The first time I walked through the women's routines, retracing their steps, the city felt heavier. I went to the convenience store where one of them bought water minutes before she vanished. I stood at the bus stop where another was last seen leaning against the plastic shelter. I followed the cracked sidewalks that led from the shelters toward Imperial Avenue. I watched people walk by with their shoulders hunched against the cold. I listened to the rumble of buses, the hum of traffic, the distant shouts of kids playing. Ordinary sounds, sounds that make you forget extraordinary evil, can thrive a block away. Some disappearances were violent. Some were subtle. Some were witnessed only by the killer, and some were witnessed by no one at all. The truth is that you don't hear a woman disappear. You don't feel it. There is no thunder, no siren, no shattering of glass. A disappearance is quiet. It's only loud in hindsight when the silence finally cracks. The timeline of missing women eventually intersected like tangled wires. At first glance, it looked random, but as I mapped the dates and locations, a shape emerged. Not a perfect one, but enough to see a constellation forming around one address, one man, one house that stood in the middle of all these broken lines. When I finally pinned the last photo on the board, I stepped back. 11 faces, 11 stories, abruptly severed. But the space between those photos was the most horrifying part. That space represented the years when no one connected them. The years when families searched alone. The years when the smell on the street was dismissed. The years when warnings were filed away instead of followed. And there, in the center of it all, sat the quiet house on Imperial Avenue, a house full of ghosts, long before the police ever opened the door. This phase of my investigation taught me something I will never forget. You cannot understand a serial killer by studying the killer. You understand him by studying the people he chose, their vulnerabilities, their needs, their hopes, their desperation, their invisible battles. These women were chosen because society had already abandoned them. Their disappearances went unnoticed because the world didn't expect them to be found. This was the part of the case that hurt the most, because the truth was not just that Sowell killed them. The truth was that he killed them in a world where the alarms should have sounded but never did. As I drove away from one of the victims' homes late at night, the streetlights flickering above me, I realized something chilling. The missing women of Imperial Avenue were not missing because they vanished. They were missing because no one looked for them in time. And that realization would lead me straight into part 3, where I would step inside the world of Anthony Sowell himself. But for now, as I looked once more at the photos on my dashboard, I whispered the same promise I whisper in every case like this. You are not forgotten. Not anymore. There's a moment in every investigation when you stop looking at the crime and start looking at the man behind it. You step across a line, sometimes without noticing, and suddenly you're not just examining evidence. You're walking through someone's mind, their memories, their routines, their darkness. With Anthony Sowell, that moment came when I first stepped inside his house. Most crime scenes tell a story. Some tell it gently, through small details. Others scream it in blood and broken glass. Sowell's house told a story in silence. It was not loud. It was not chaotic. Instead, it felt like standing inside a vacuum, like the air had been emptied of whatever makes a place alive. I remember the first steps clearly. The floor creaked beneath my boots, but the creak wasn't what struck me. It was the way the sound disappeared instantly, absorbed by the walls. The entire place felt muffled, like it was swallowing noise. I could almost imagine how many screams those walls had swallowed. I knew the layout from reports, photographs, and interviews with detectives who were there when the house was first breached. But nothing prepares you for the emotional weight of a place like that. The moment you cross the threshold, It feels like time bends. The smell was gone by the time I arrived. Cleaning crews and months of exposure had erased it. But the memory of it clung to the structure. You could sense it in a way that didn't rely on your nose. It was in the floorboards, in the corners, in the air itself. I paused in the living room, imagining the women who had entered this place, believing this man wasn't a monster, believing he was offering safety, warmth, maybe companionship, a drink, a meal, a place to rest. They didn't know that once the door closed, the world outside forgot them. Every killer builds a world in which they feel comfortable. Sowell's world wasn't built on trophies or elaborate rituals like some serial killers. His world was built on neglect, filth, isolation. A place no one wanted to enter, and therefore a place where no one would look closely. That gave him freedom. Freedom to kill, freedom to hide bodies, freedom to let death linger without consequence. The kitchen was cluttered, but not in the way a busy family leaves clutter. It was the clutter of someone who had stopped caring long ago. Objects seemed abandoned mid-motion, as though life here had been paused, replayed, paused again. A pot still sat on the stove, rust creeping around its edges. A broken fan lay in the corner, like it had given up. The refrigerator door didn't fully close. The walls were stained with the residue of years without light, years without meaning. I opened the basement door and stared into darkness that felt too thick to be natural. Even with the flashlight, it felt like the light wasn't reaching the bottom. I took a breath and walked down, step by slow step. My hand skimmed the railing cold metal, smooth in places, rusted in others. The air grew heavier as I descended, not because of heat or humidity, but because the basement felt like the core of his world. It was where concealment met routine, where the line between life and death blurred for the victims. Down there, the temperature shifted in a way I still can't describe fully. It felt colder than the house, but not in a refreshing way. More like the cold you feel standing near something that has no heartbeat. Even months after the discovery, the atmosphere weighed on me. I stood in the space where bodies had been found. I imagined the detectives discovering remains in plastic bags, behind walls, in corners where the darkness seemed to thicken. Places hold memory. This basement held too much of it. As I walked through the space, I tried to understand what kept Sowell functioning, what allowed him to kill without being paralyzed by guilt or fear. The answer wasn't intelligence or planning. It was repetition, routine. He fell into a cycle that numbed him to reality. Violence became normal. Death became normal. Decomposition became normal. When the unthinkable becomes normal, the mind stops resisting. Upstairs, the bedrooms told another story, one of loneliness. Sowell didn't live like a man who enjoyed life. He lived like someone surviving inside himself. A mattress on the floor, a small lamp, clothes scattered with no pattern. Nothing on the walls except stains that looked like the ghosts of things never cleaned. People like to think that monsters look monstrous. But Sowell's world wasn't theatrical. It wasn't the lair of a villain from a storybook. It was the home of a man whose life had collapsed inward long before he began killing. And that collapse created the environment where murder became possible. One bedroom felt wrong the moment I entered it, not because of what I saw, but because of what I felt. A heaviness that settled in my chest. I knew the reports said one of the victims had been found near that space. I didn't know which one. I didn't want to know at that moment. I wanted to feel the room as it was, without letting names shape the atmosphere. There are places in the world where cries echo long after the voices fall silent. That room was one of them. To understand Sowell, I had to dig into his past. His childhood was not an excuse, but it was a clue. He grew up in a house filled with abuse, physical violence, emotional cruelty. He watched people hurt each other. He learned early that pain is a language. Some children grow into adults who break the cycle. Others grow into adults who replicate it in darker, more twisted forms. From a young age, Sowell learned dominance through force. Later, during his time in the military, he learned discipline without empathy. And after prison, after being convicted of rape, he learned that society had already decided what he was: a predator, a problem, someone people avoided. That isolation became fuel. Men who live in the shadows create darker shadows. Still, all of that explains, but does not justify. I read through every interview, every psychological report, every recorded conversation. There was a pattern in the way he spoke. He distanced himself from everything he did. He talked about bodies like objects. He talked about women like inconveniences. He minimized his role, claiming memory loss at times and confusion at others. Serial killers often test the boundaries of truth, weaving lies into half-truths until even they can't distinguish the difference. But there was something colder in Sowell's case. He carried no pride in his crimes, no thrill, no fascination. He carried detachment, emotional emptiness. And emptiness is a frightening thing. A man who kills for fantasy at least reveals his motive. A man who kills because he feels nothing is unpredictable. To understand his world, I spoke with people who knew him before the murders. A former neighbor said he was polite. He'd wave, sometimes chat. He helped carry groceries once. Another said he looked troubled, like he was carrying weight no one could see. A woman he briefly dated said he drank too much and had violent mood swings. But none of them saw a killer. That's the illusion. Predators rarely look like predators. One woman described him in a way that stayed with me. She said he looked like someone who had forgotten how to be alive. When she said that, something inside me clicked. You cannot understand a man like Sowell by looking into his eyes. You understand him by looking into the void behind them. I walked the neighborhood again, this time imagining Sowell among the people, shopping, standing on the porch, watching the street, picking his victims not through elaborate stalking, but through opportunity, through proximity, through routine. They came to him because he made himself available. Predators adapt to their environment. Sowell adapted by blending in. But what chilled me most was that he didn't need to hide well. The system hid him naturally. The neglect of the victims hid him. The assumptions hid him. The silence hid him. The house that sat ignored for years hid him. He didn't build a fortress. The world built one around him. One night, as I sat in my car outside the house, I imagined him sitting on the same porch years earlier, drinking, watching the streetlights flicker, pretending to be harmless, knowing he wasn't. That duality is what defines many serial killers, the face they show and the face they hide. But with Sowell, I began to suspect that the face he showed and the face he hid were not so different. Both were empty. As investigators, we like to believe we can read people, that we can sense danger, but danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it slips into the world quietly, wearing human skin, speaking polite words, holding open doors. In the days following my walkthrough of Sowell's home, I kept returning to the same thought. Monsters don't always roar. Sometimes they whisper. Sometimes they breathe quietly in the house next door. Sometimes they live behind a door you walk past every day. I knew then that to understand the full scope of his crimes, I had to go deeper than his home or his past. I had to look at the night. The truth finally cracked open. The night the police entered his house, not as guests or neighbors, but as hunters walking into the lair of a predator who had operated in silence for far too long. Part 4 would bring me to that night, the discovery, the unraveling, the moment when the house on Imperial Avenue surrendered its secrets. But in this moment, standing inside his world, surrounded by the residue of years of horror, I made myself a promise. I would take the victims out of this house one last time, not physically, but through truth, through the story the world refused to hear soon enough. Their voices may have been silenced here, but they would not remain silent in my investigation, not while I was still breathing. There are moments in an investigation that divide time, moments that tell you the world you walked into will not be the world you walk out of. For the Anthony Sowell case, that moment came on a cool evening in late October of 2009, a night when Imperial Avenue finally exhaled the truth it had been holding for years. I wasn't there the exact moment officers stepped onto the porch, but I've retraced their steps so many times that it feels like I was. I've walked the approach, I've touched the railings, I've stood where they stood. I've imagined the tension in the air, the uncertainty in their eyes. The quiet before a door becomes a doorway into something the human mind is not prepared to see. It began with a warrant, a simple piece of paper born from a survivor's courage, a woman who escaped Sowell's house bruised, terrified, but alive. Her voice cut through the years of neglect. She told the police what happened. She pointed them toward the house. She forced the system to listen, even if only for a moment. And sometimes, a single moment is all it takes to change the trajectory of a case. When officers arrived, the house looked as it always had, broken but unthreatening. A structure collapsing under age rather than violence. But as they stepped forward, one of them later said he felt something shift. Like the air changed temperature, like the house sensed them. They knocked. No answer. They knocked again. Still nothing. Finally, with the warrant in hand, they entered. What they walked into was not chaos at first glance. It was something worse. Normalcy mixed with decay, the kind of decay that doesn't scream but whispers. They saw old furniture, dirty walls, trash scattered across the floor. But none of that explained the smell. The smell was everywhere, thick, heavy, sweet in a way that made the stomach turn. It was a smell that lived beneath the breath of the house, rising through cracks, hiding in corners. One officer later said that when he breathed in, it felt like the air was coated with something he could never wipe off. They moved through the rooms, cautiously calling out, announcing their presence. But the house answered with silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something waiting. When they reached the upstairs, they found things that raised alarms, evidence of violence, evidence of lives, interrupted but still no bodies. They didn't know yet what they were standing on. They didn't know the truth was beneath them, around them, inside the walls. Then one officer opened the door to the basement. From everything I've gathered, that moment shattered the illusion of normalcy. It was like opening the lid of a box that had been sealed too long. The air that escaped was thick with the memory of death. Even before they descended, they knew. They just didn't know how much. Flashlights flickered as they stepped down. The basement swallowed the light, and then the beam hit what no one wanted to see. A shape, then another wrapped in plastic, buried under debris, hidden in corners. Bodies, human bodies, women who had been missing for years, discovered in a space no larger than a small room. 11 lives reduced to evidence bags. 11 stories cut off. 11 warnings unheeded. The officers froze. Training kicks in during chaos, but not during horror. Horror is something else entirely. It slows time. It forces breath to stop. It demands acknowledgement. One officer radioed in, his voice shaking. Another whispered a quiet prayer. A detective stepped back up the stairs, hand trembling, eyes wide, as if trying to escape the basement while leaving the truth behind. You can't unsee something like that. You can only carry it. When the crime scene team arrived, Imperial Avenue transformed. Lights flashed across the houses. Cameras recorded every step. Forensics gathered tools. Officers secured the perimeter. But even then, even with all the procedures in place, no one was prepared for what the house still held. Behind the house, in the yard, beneath layers of soil, more remains were found. In crawl spaces, under the porch, the property was a graveyard disguised as a home. Neighbors watched from their windows, some crying, some silent, some shaking their heads as if trying to wake from a nightmare. One woman fainted. An older man walked out of his house in his bare feet, staring at the scene like he had finally found the source of the unease that had haunted him for years. I arrived days later, but the energy was still there. Crime scenes don't fade just because bodies are removed. They leave echoes, they cling to the air, to the soil, to the structure. The entire block felt like it was grieving. I walked to the basement entrance. Even with the door open and the light pouring in, the darkness inside seemed reluctant to move, like it had grown comfortable there, like it didn't want to let go of the secrets it had held. Later, I stood in the yard, staring at the disturbed earth. Forensics had carefully removed every bone, every fragment. But the ground remembers. It always does. The soil had been turned so many times, it looked like it had been trying to push the truth upward for years. But no one wanted to dig. I spoke with the officers who had been first on the scene. Some cried during the interviews. Hardened detectives, men and women with decades on the force, struggled to find words. One said he had nightmares of plastic bags. Another said he hasn't eaten pork since that night because the smell triggered memories. Trauma manifests in strange ways. The moment Soul returned to the house during the investigation was another scene burned into memory. He had gone out to buy alcohol when officers first entered. When he came back, the street was filled with police lights. Officers drew their weapons. He froze. For a second, witnesses said he looked like a child caught doing something he didn't fully understand. Then he ran. It wasn't a graceful run. It wasn't even a desperate run. It was the run of a man whose world had finally collapsed. Officers chased him through alleys, around corners, across fences. The chase didn't last long. When they caught him, he didn't fight, he didn't scream, he didn't deny. He simply surrendered, as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if the weight of what he'd done had finally overtaken him. When I watched the interrogation footage, one thing stood out. Soul didn't show fear. He didn't show remorse. He didn't show anger. He showed vacancy, like a man already half gone, as if the Anthony Saul they captured was only an empty shell of the man who had lived in that house. After the discovery, the media erupted. Satellite trucks lined the street. Reporters camped in the cold. Journalists shouted questions at officers who had no answers. America wanted to know how this happened. How 11 women vanished without a city noticing. How a house filled with death blended into the community without triggering alarm bells. But the hardest questions weren't for the police. They were for society, for a world that had ignored these women long before they died. As days passed, bodies were identified. Families received confirmations they had begged for, but also feared. Mothers collapsed in hallways. Sisters screamed. Fathers stared blankly at the floor. For some, it was closure. For others, it was a wound reopening. I visited the medical examiner's office while they worked. Teams moved quietly, respectfully. They cataloged each bone, each marking, each injury. They pieced together fragments of lives cut short. That work takes strength. Most people don't possess strength to stare into the face of cruelty and treat it with compassion. Walking back onto Imperial Avenue after witnessing all of that, I could feel the street itself had changed. It had shifted from a place hiding secrets to a place demanding answers. The weight of silence had lifted, replaced by a raw wound that needed tending. The discovery was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of accountability, the beginning of outrage, the beginning of the public asking why these women were overlooked. But for me, it was something else entirely. It was a reminder that monsters don't stay hidden because they are clever. They stay hidden because the world refuses to look closely. Part 4 ends with the house exposed, the truth unearthed, the victims found. But justice was still distant. What came next would be a courtroom where the world would hear the details in a place where truth cannot hide behind walls. That would be Part 5. But as I left Imperial Avenue that night, I paused at the gate. I looked back at the house, and I whispered something I didn't plan to say aloud. You stayed silent for too long. But now the world hears you. There is a certain stillness that settles over a city after a monster is caught. It's not relief, not closure. It's something heavier, something uncertain. Cleveland carried that stillness in the months following the discovery on Imperial Avenue. People walked slower, spoke softer, looked longer at strangers passing by. Because once you learn that horror can hide in plain sight, you never look at ordinary faces the same way again. For me, the final stretch of the investigation began inside a courthouse, a building filled with voices demanding answers, justice, and explanations that couldn't possibly repair what had been broken. The trial of Anthony Sowell was not just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. I remember the first day vividly. The courtroom was cold, the kind of cold that settles into your bones. Reporters filled the front rows. Families of victims sat behind them, clutching photographs, worn down by their fingers. Officers who worked the case lined the walls. And then there was Sowell, escorted in, sitting with an expression as empty as the house he lived in. He didn't look around, didn't scan the room, didn't react when the prosecutor listed the charges. 11 counts of aggravated murder, rape, kidnapping, abuse of a corpse, a list so long it felt like reading the chapters of a book no one should ever have to write. The prosecutor spoke with a tone sharpened by grief and exhaustion. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The facts were loud enough. Each victim was named. Each disappearance retold. Each recovered body described with clinical precision because the justice system requires facts, even when facts tear at the heart. But the most powerful voices came from the families. One mother stood and described the last time she saw her daughter. She said her girl left with a smile, promising she'd be back before dark. When the mother called her phone that night, it rang twice and then stopped. For years, she wondered if her daughter had been alive in those seconds, wondered if she could have saved her, wondered if someone had heard her scream. Another family member, hand shaking, read a letter that had been prepared months earlier. A letter she wrote for a daughter whose body she would never get to bury because too much of her had been lost. She didn't cry as she read. She'd run out of tears long before the trial. Her voice was a hollow shell of something that once held hope. The defense argued mental issues, argued that Sowell had endured trauma, argued that he was shaped by suffering. But suffering does not grant permission to inflict suffering on others. Pain is not a currency to be repaid with blood, and the jury saw through the attempt to twist tragedy into justification. What struck me most was Sowell's demeanor. He didn't flinch when victims' names were spoken, didn't blink when images of the crime scene were shown, didn't shift in his seat when survivors spoke directly to him. One survivor locked eyes with him for nearly 30 seconds and said, "You tried to kill me. I'm here. You're not taking anything else from me." Sowell simply stared back, neither cold nor warm, but blank, as if the words passed through him without leaving a mark. During one session, the forensic pathologist walked the jury through each recovered body. Clinical language, bones, injuries, positioning, signs of strangulation. It was hard to listen to, but the truth had to be spoken. A courtroom cannot sentence the unsaid. When the verdict came, it wasn't met with cheers. Justice rarely feels like victory. It feels like breath returning after being held too long. The jury found him guilty on all counts. The judge imposed the death sentence, and yet the courtroom remained still. Families held hands, officers lowered their heads, someone whispered a prayer, and Sowell sat unchanged, as if the verdict had landed on someone else. After the trial, I walked outside into a hallway buzzing with reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones chased sound bites. But justice cannot be summarized in 10-second clips. So I stepped away from the noise. I needed quiet to think, quiet to process the weight of what I had witnessed. The truth is that trials don't end stories. Trials only label them. The deeper ending, the real ending, happens in the years that follow. And for Cleveland, the years after Sowell's conviction were marked by something more important than punishment reflection. People began asking hard questions. Why were the early warnings ignored? Why were the victims seen as unreliable? Why wasn't the smell investigated sooner? Why did the system value stability over humanity? These questions echoed through communities, through police departments, through council meetings. They sparked changes in how missing persons cases were treated, especially for vulnerable populations. But change rarely moves fast enough for those already lost. One afternoon, months after the verdict, I visited the lot where Sowell's house had stood. It had been demolished, reduced to flattened earth, as if erasing the structure would erase the memory. But the land didn't forget, soil remembers. Wind remembers. Silence remembers. I stood in the middle of the empty lot, listening to the faint sounds of traffic. Children laughing somewhere down the block. Dogs barking, life going on. And yet, beneath those sounds, I felt the echo of the women whose voices had been silenced there. I thought about each of them, their stories, their families, their struggles, their dreams. They were more than victims. They were lives interrupted, lives that deserved to be protected long before a courtroom gave them recognition. This case taught me something that no amount of training ever could. Monsters are not defined by what they look like or where they live. Monsters are defined by what the world ignores long enough for them to grow. Anthony Sowell didn't thrive because he was brilliant. He thrived because he was invisible, and he was invisible because the women he targeted were invisible. That is the legacy the city must never forget. Years later, I visited the cemetery where some of the victims were buried. The grass was green, the sky bright that day. Families had left flowers, some fresh, some wilted. I walked slowly, reading names, touching the tops of headstones lightly with my fingers, a reminder to myself that my job doesn't end with arrest reports or trial notes. My job ends with truth, with acknowledgement, standing there, In that quiet space, I whispered something I had carried for months. You are seen now. You are heard. Your story lives. This is Miller Files, and this concludes the darkest investigation I've ever walked. But the echoes of Imperial Avenue will follow me, not as ghosts, but as reminders of what happens when a society stops listening. May we never stop listening again.